In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing my Blackguard build. This is an all-game build that can be used from pretty much very early on in the game, as you can get the weapons for this pretty quickly, as well as the armor set that I'm using. Some of the talismans might take you a little bit longer to get. But let's get into what this build is. This is a fist build using the Clinging Bone weapon. This is a weapon I got to play around with in our fists video, and I really like this weapon, and let's get into what I like about it. So let's talk about the Clinging Bone first. The fastest way to get this is to go to the village of the Albinarics and Learning of the Lakes, pick up the Haligtree secret medallion, the right half of it, go back to Round Table Hold. You'll be attacked by Ensha. If you defeat Ensha, you'll gain this weapon, and you'll also gain a lot of the pieces of the armor set that I'm using for this build. Now, this doesn't take you very long to do. You simply have to have access to Round Table Hold. The fastest way, in my opinion, to get to Round Table Hold is to just go to Margit in the Margit fight. If you let him beat you, you can rest at the site of grace afterward, and you'll actually be able to be teleported there. Like, you don't have to defeat him in order to go. You can actually let him beat you, or you can ride all the way over to Caelid, and that will allow you to get there as well if you don't like the idea of him killing you. So let's get into the Clinging Bone weapon itself. This weapon does physical and magic damage. It's primarily a dexterity scaling weapon, but has some arcane scaling on it. And if you look at other weapons in Elden Ring that have dexterity and arcane scaling, or strength and arcane scaling, that do physical and magic damage, as far as I know, there's only two other ones, and that is the Regalia of Eochaid, which I'm also using as an alternative weapon in this build, and the Murray Executioner's Sword. This would lead me to believe that these three weapons are related. The Murray Executioner's Sword seems to have been infused with magic from Eochaid, from Elmer of the Briar. The Regalia of Eochaid is obviously from Eochaid, and then the Clinging Bone is from some mysterious figure. The fact that it has similar damage types with similar scaling, and you'll also notice that Elmer of the Briar uses the Lifesteal Fist attack when you fight him sometimes. So this leads me to believe that this bone is from an important person, or a person from Eochaid as well. But enough about the lore of the weapon. What I really love about Lifesteal Fist, and honestly the first time I ever played around with this was during the Fists research video. And what this does is it essentially grabs onto an enemy that's a humanoidish enemy. There's a list on the wiki of the enemies on the Lifesteal Fist page. This is a lot of enemies affected by this skill, and it goes through blocks, and it seems to have like a 2 or 3 second cooldown, so you can't just spam it back to back. But what this does is it allows you to defeat some of the harder enemies in the game, like the Cleanrot Knights, or the Banished Knights, or other enemies that you might be having difficulty with. Crucible Knights are even affected by this. So you can literally just grab them, and it also heals you for 30% of your max health, and also each tick of damage it does builds up, hits towards the triggers of things like Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, which we use in this build. So it's not going to, like, if you're going to town on an enemy, wailing away on them, and then use this, your buff's not going to wear off while this is going. It'll actually continue to build up, which I find fantastic. Now, the real kicker of Lifesteal Fist is that it does predominantly magic damage. I don't know exactly the ratio of magic damage to physical damage, but I'm pretty sure it's about 80 to 90% magic damage with 10% physical, while the weapon is predominantly physical damage with just a small amount magical. So that's a little bit weird on a weapon, needless to say. So if you use, like, the Magic Scorpion Charm, for instance, you'll get a lot more damage out of Lifesteal Fist, but you really won't add too much damage to your regular attacks. So you kind of got to decide if that's something you want to add in your build. Magic Shroud and Crack Tier, same thing. You don't tend to use Lifesteal Fist on a lot of bosses, so I don't think it's worth putting that in your Crack Tier, and we'll go into that in a minute. But it's kind of a weird thing where you're dealing mostly physical damage with your weapon, but then your weapon skill is mostly magic damage. There are a few weapons like that in this game. This happens to be one of those. However, you can put, like, Shard of Alexander on and still increase the damage of this weapon's skill without having to take the negative of Magic Scorpion Charm, which is extra incoming damage. So what I like to do with this weapon is you can either dual wield it and, get into rapid attack, which is good for some bosses. You can block counter with it with a shield. The stance damage that fist weapons do in general is pretty good. So you can block counter pretty regularly with this, allowing you to stance break enemies. And sometimes when you're in boss fights, you can, like, stance break a boss and then go into dual wield and then just unload on them. Or you can stance break a boss and then bust out your Regalia of Eochaid and just use the corkscrew attack on it to just absolutely shred the health of bosses. And what I really love about this build, it has tons of flexibility. You can block counter, you can dual wield, you can use Lifesteal Fist on enemies that can be used on. You can switch to the Regalia of Eochaid when you're fighting a boss that it can't be used on. and maybe you want to use its weapon skill. So you really have so many different playstyles in this setup with 2 weapons that scale very similarly. So then for shields, I have the Scorpion Kite shield because it has low strength requirements, and we are not putting a lot of points in strength for this build. But also, it just kind of matches the theme and looks fucking awesome, so I really like how it fits into the Blackguard type theme. But you could also use something like the Jellyfish shield if you want. You will have to invest more points into strength, but this will allow you to buff your damage when you're, using the one-handed version of the Clinging Bone or Regalia of Eochaid. And then you can just swap to dual wield when you want to use Lifesteal Fist if you want and have extra damage with your one-handed attacks. Because I do one-hand the Clinging Bone quite a lot. Either is up to you. I mean, you can use basically any shield you want. Obviously, just not something with huge strength requirements, or you're going to, really nerf your melee damage. So armor-wise for this build, I'm using the Royal Remains set, and I've mixed out a couple pieces in order to get over the 51 poise breakpoint, because I think you're at like 44 if you wear the full set. And that basically means you need to wear the Bullgoat's Talisman, or you're going to get interrupted a lot. And you chain a lot of attacks with this build, so you definitely don't want to get interrupted. But there's so many good Talismans for this build, I just thought, you know what, I'm going to sub out a couple pieces in order to get over that 51 poise point, so that I can free up that Talisman slot. Normally I don't care, but this is a very Talisman-hungry build, and I really wanted that extra Talisman slot here. So for Talismans, we have Ritual Sword Talisman. I really like this for this build, even though you trade damage sometimes, because of Lifesteal Fist replenishing 30% of your health. So it's really easy to top yourself off, get back up to full health to get that extra damage. I also really like Millicent's Prosthesis for this build. We have a primary dex scaling weapon in both of these weapons, so you get good damage out of that dexterity, and then you get the attack power buildup on successive hits, which is both good for both of these weapons, so that's very good for this as well. And you can also use Winged Sword Insignia here, or Rotten Winged Sword Insignia if somebody gave you one, to further boost your attack power with rapid attacks with your two-handed attacks, or, when you're using the Corkscrew weapon skill of Regalia of Eochaid. And then I have Shard of Alexander or Warrior Jar Shard, depending on where you are in the game, to further boost the damage of Lifesteal Fist, and also to boost the damage of the Corkscrew attack of Regalia of Eochaid. There are alternative talismans you can use. For instance, the Axe Talisman is really good. I find I one-hand the Clinging Bone a lot, and getting extra damage on your charged heavy attacks is nice. Additionally, as I mentioned, Magic Scorpion Charm is not bad if you're trying to increase the damage of Lifesteal Fist, and it will actually increase the damage of the Corkscrew attack on Regalia of Eochaid as well if you want to get more damage out of that. And you could even sub in something like the Dagger Talisman for more critical damage when you block, counter, and stance break enemies. That happens a lot. That's also not a bad one to sub in. Or if you want to sub in Godfrey Icon for when you know you're going to be using Regalia of Eochaid's weapon skill in a boss fight and you're going to be charging it, that can be good. Well, basically what I'm saying here is there's a lot of options for talismans, and you can swap them around depending on the playstyle that you're currently using. For instance, if you're fighting, like, I don't know, Crucible Knight, you're going to be leaning into Lifesteal Fist. But if you're fighting something like, I don't know, Blackblade Kindred, for instance, you're not going to be using Lifesteal Fist, so Shard of Alexander doesn't make any sense to be there unless you're using Regalia of Eochaid. So there are things to factor in. You can swap these around on the fly to really get the most out of the situation that you're facing. So then attribute-wise for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 20 Mind, 30 Endurance, 12 Strength, 15 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, 50 Arcane. You don't need any Faith or Intelligence for this build, but I will say that if you are taking this build further into, New Game Plus or into New Game Plus Plus, you might want to consider putting some points in Faith to, take advantage of Golden Vow, and maybe to cast some incantations because you have very high arcane, so you could use like the Dragon Communion Seal quite effectively. That is also an option for this build. You'll probably want to take Vigor higher in New Game Plus simply because, again, Lifesteal Fist gives you 30% of your max health. So the more health you have, the more you're going to gain back. That's really good. You do trade damage with your fists all the time with this, so having more health is not bad. We have a very low amount of Mind for this build. We don't use Lifesteal Fist all that often, and we don't use Regalia of Eochaid's weapon skill all that often in my experience. So you don't really need a lot of Mind. And you can skew your Flasks more to the FP side because you're healing from Lifesteal Fist a lot anyway. Endurance is at 30 in order to have a decent armor set, carry a shield, 2 weapons, and the talismans. But also because when you're dual-wielding the Clinging Bone and you're spamming attacks, you will run out of stamina if you don't have a good amount. So it's kind of doubles for equip weight and stamina so you don't run out. 12 strength is there to meet the requirements of the Scorpion Kite shield. If you use the Jellyfish shield, this will need to be 20. If you use a different shield like the Brass shield or something, this will need to be like 14, something like that. This will vary a little bit depending on what shield you decide to use. And then I have 55 Dexterity and 50 Arcane. Dexterity and Arcane for the Clinging Bones scale about the same, roughly. Dexterity being a little bit ahead there, so depends on how you want your damage. Again, Arcane's going to apply to your Lifesteal Fist damage, where Dexterity won't. So Dexterity is good for melee damage, but Arcane is better for melee and Lifesteal, so if you want to prioritize Arcane, that's definitely something I would recommend. Especially if you plan to add some faith in and cast spells, definitely prioritize Arcane. And then for Flask of Wonders Physique, you can go a few ways. As I mentioned, you can use the Magic Scorpion Charm. That will boost Lifesteal Fist damage, but I just find that you don't use this during boss fights that much, and you don't deal a lot of magic damage outside of that, so it's not super great. It isn't bad if you're using the weapon skill of the Regalia of Eochaid, but you can also use the tier that increases your damage with multiple hits. That's good for no matter what setup you have, so that's good. Or Stamina Recovery, again, you tend to go through Stamina with this build, that's also good. Or even charged attacks, because you will use your Clinging Bone charged heavy attacks sometimes in order to try and stagger bosses before busting out dual wield attacks, etc. And then when it comes to, Great Rune, Godric's is fantastic for this build. You have 6 of the 8 stats that you need. This will allow you to also get rid of strength, or use a better strength shield when you have this up. This is a good one. Radon's is also not bad for more FP, HP, stamina. All those things are good for this build. So that wraps up our Blackguard build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. We are going to be continuing with the weapon videos. I can't decide whether I want to do spellcasting implements or bows next. These are going to be slightly different videos, as I mentioned, because there isn't really a moveset as much involved with them as there are in the other weapons. And scaling isn't like a huge factor when it comes to bows, although it is with casting implements. So the bows video is going to be a bit unique. So stay tuned. And as always, if you have other tips for this build, leave them in the comments or questions, leave them there as well, and I will answer them as soon as I can.